Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here post-Sandy, or at least partly post-Sandy. I also want to make a special thanks to the Whitney staff. Our offices have been rather disrupted, but the staff insisted that the show must go on, and I'm happy they did, because you can see from the turnout tonight that it was well worth the effort. So thank you, Margie and Catherine and everybody else. I'm Adam Weinberg, Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney, and I want to welcome you to the 8th Annual Walter Annenberg Lecture Series. This program highlights a distinguished artist who has made a significant contribution to American art and culture. I would particularly like to acknowledge tonight Stephen and Ann Ames. Stephen is our beloved trustee, and Ann, his amazing wife, who are here tonight representing the Annenberg family. I've succeeded in embarrassing them again because they're looking down at the ground, but thank you so much for your great support of the museum. This is one of the great pleasures of being the director of the Whitney. You are allowed to embarrass people just as they embarrass you. But it is our great pleasure and honor to present Sarah Z for this year's Annenberg Lecture. Sarah's work has been groundbreaking in its approach to sculpture and the transformation of space. Known for her large-scale installations, works on paper, wall-mounted reliefs, she continually redefines our sense of perception through her extraordinary capacity to assemble thousands, literally thousands of small everyday objects. Toothpicks, plastic flowers, ice cube trays, aspirin, and scores of other materials, and balance them almost magically in architectonic works of massive scale. This singular approach to sculptural work and the unique vocabulary that she has developed have established her as one of the most important artists working today. Sarah has said that scale is at the heart of her work. And citing a quote by the great artist Robert Smithson that speaks to her method, she said, she quoted, "Size determines an object, but scale determines the art. If viewed in terms of scale, not size, a room could be made to take on the immensity of the solar system." She says that for her, the challenge is to find a balanced location somewhere on the scale from the mundane to the profound. And we'll address that, I hope, a little bit tonight. Indeed, every one of her projects transports the viewer through a process of telescoping out from the minute to the grand, recalibrating one's sense of near and far, center and edge. Sarah's work celebrates the complexity of seeing and knowing, of orientation and disorientation. We look at her sculpture and we think that we know what something is, only to have that certainty upended by careful looking or by an ingenious sleight of hand. Her works have an endless capacity to surprise and delight with their constantly evolving subjects and objects. The Whitney has long believed in Sarah's vision of what an artwork can be. She was featured in the 2000 Whitney Biennial, had a solo project, The Triple Point of Water, here in 2003, and she told me tonight what the triple point of water is, and maybe we'll get her to repeat it on stage. And that was done in 2003, and we'll see some images of that tonight. Sarah has had numerous solo exhibitions around the world, including the ICA in London, the Malmö Kunsthall in Sweden, the Cartier Foundation in Paris, the Museum Museum in Luxembourg, and in the US, at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Walker Art Center, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and recently at the Asia Society in New York, and a spectacular installation on the High Line. In addition to the Whitney's collection, her work is held by MoMA, the Guggenheim, SF MoMA, LACMA, and many others. She is recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant and the AICA Award for Best Project in a Public Space for the project she did on the High Line, which I hope many of you had a chance to see. And she also received an American Federation of the Arts Cultural Leadership Award. I'm particularly grateful that Sarah is here tonight because she has taken this year to devote herself to working almost exclusively on her 2013 Venice Biennale project, which will be presented this June. So we're very honored that she is the artist who is representing the United States, and we're happy to have her join us here this evening. So Sarah, come on up and we'll talk.
Thanks, Adam. Quickly, that was just it was a really nice introduction. And one of the things that I have always appreciated, even before I knew Adam, was that whenever I heard him speak publicly, when he was a curator and then when he became a director, was he always thought about ideas, and he always talked about art. He always mentioned artists, no matter what he was doing, and he always had sort of a real finger on sort of the beginning of why everyone is here, I think. So I always appreciate that about you. So thank you. It's very thoughtful.
Thank you. Oh, it's mine. Yep. Okay. So let's start maybe from the beginning. And you were trained in painting and architecture, but I think of your work, and I think most people do, is dealing more with the notion of installation and sculpture. What is sculpture for you, and how does that differ from installation, or does it? And I think we have some images, and you can jump right in. I think that's always the best way to work.
So, Adam asked me to bring some slides, and he gave me a sense of some of the things he was going to ask. So I thought I'd start with this image. It's an image from when I was actually in graduate school. And undergrad, I had studied, as Adam mentioned, I studied architecture and painting, actually. And I think a lot of this way I came to sculpture was really from those two places. I think from painting, one of the things I really loved about painting was the improvisation. This idea that as you produced a painting, there's a traditional sense of painting, but that's really what I was trained in. But that every time you put down a mark, the entire painting changed. And so that the way of making sculpture really was this kind of incremental mark making, where you found things in that process. And then very fundamental things about architecture, such as scale, circulation, relationship of the body and space. So when I came to sculpture, I really asked this question about objects and what can an object do that a painting can't do. How does an object become valuable? And I started with this idea of using materials that in some ways were very, the least valuable thing that we could think of. And I sort of used the equation of value in terms of something that was not thought of aesthetically at all, but entirely used practically. And so I started by doing a piece that was made all of toilet paper. So I just sat down and made, I made these rules. So we were talking about Saul the Witten rules earlier, before this, but I made these rules that I would sit down and I would take one sheet of toilet paper, make something, and keep making it until it became uninteresting, and then make something else. This piece was first made in my studio, and then they asked me to put in a show, but in my studio I let it kind of climb all over the studio space. But when they wanted to put a show, they wanted to put it in a sort of a rug in the middle of the room. And what I decided that I wanted to do was really make it feel like you couldn't tell what had happened, why it had happened, where the beginning was, where the end was. So that first image was actually the storage room of the space. So that was sort of the beginning. And then I started pulling in, this was back in my studio, I started pulling in things. I really wanted to play with this, again, this question, what can you do with a sculpture that you can't do with a painting? And I was very frustrated with painting that it had these borders and that you were constantly referring to painting itself, no matter what you did. So this is actually my studio, and I was also interested in the idea of a practical space becoming aesthetic, and having no use. So that's my chair in the corner of my desk. That it's the whole space became taken over by the art.
It's interesting in these first works. It feels as if you're making paintings on the floor or making compositions on the floor. And actually, I was just thinking, and there appears the ladder. If you were up on the ladder, it's almost like you're looking down at the work, but yet the ladder is part of the work.
There's the next slide.
There you go.
Yeah. I put these slides in too because Adam asked me a bunch of questions about how do you move from sculpture to painting. And in the beginning, actually, in many ways, I was using objects in a painterly way, and they were on a surface. As I started to do it more and more, this is the last I'll show you, this piece was they asked to bring to a gallery space, and again, they wanted to put on a pedestal. So I went to this space and I decided I wanted to put it actually, again, in an existing space. So as you entered the gallery, it went all along the right side of the gallery, down the windows, and pulled you actually into the gallery dealer space. I want to play with this idea of when you go in a gallery, sometimes you're not sure what part's for you, what part's for the gallery, and really pull you into private and public spaces and in between, and not know where was the lamp mine, was the lamp theirs, was the window supposed to be open. So these are all objects. There's about 250 objects made sculpted out of ivory soap, and then they were mixed in with found objects. So again, you sort of didn't know what was made, what wasn't made.
These works are pretty planar. I mean, and they're all sitting on planes.
Yeah.
And I mean, it brings up two questions. I mean, first of all, at what point did you move away from just doing these planar and start to open it up so that it became really more of an environment to see? And the other thing I'm really struck by is when you're talking about how you couldn't tell the difference between the gallery objects and the things you put in. I was thinking about Rauschenberg's line about how art is, acting in the space between, or his combines were acting in the space between art and life. And so I'm thinking that your work, it was somewhere between. You weren't quite sure if it was life or the work itself. So those are two questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'll answer the second one, the first one second. The second one, he had asked me a little bit about artists who had influenced me. And one of the things that's interesting is I think I was really early on influenced by seeing art in museums. I was as a child from a family that liked to go to museums, and I saw Rauschenberg's work very early. And there was this excitement of something that moved from the wall to the plane and back again, and that tension between the two. I probably was about 10 years old when I first saw it. I think Rauschenberg, I think Sarah, when I first saw his, I think the first piece I saw of his was the splash piece, and just his, the way he deals with materials, gravity, the sensitivity to what a material can do and all its potential sculpturally. And I think Louise Bourgeois I saw very early on, and this idea that you could transform an inanimate material to something so intimate was something I was really drawn to. But going to this, that I put in these slides because decided to put in a slide of something that was just really playing with everything that sculpture could do that you couldn't do in a painting. And this is a piece I did in a Sana building in Kanazawa in Japan, a pretty amazing building, and everything in it is sort of circular in this building. And you enter actually below ground and you go above ground, and then the whole building is one floor. So you enter here, and this idea that you don't really know what you're looking at. This was playing with this idea of sculpture in the round. It's seeing something fall apart in front of your eyes as you move through space. So as you go up, you see this about halfway through, and it's still you don't really, it doesn't come together. And then when you come to the top, it all sort of clicks into space, and everything becomes very organized. And it was playing with this idea of this sort of idea of a narrative is when you move around the piece, it actually becomes something in space in front of your eyes as you move. And someone else the quintessential example of a sculptor who did this is Bernini, where you move to just slightly to the left or slightly to the right by 1 inch, and Apollo and Daphne turn into entirely different things. So I think I sort of learned how to be a sculptor along the way, actually, publicly.
And in the beginning, you were doing the toilet paper works, and you were actually making. I mean, there was real facture in the sense, and as opposed to assembling and collecting and gathering. I mean, what was the transition there for you?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a direct translation. I think in each sort of body of work that I've done, there's an edge between something that's handmade or mass-produced, public or private, solid or falling apart, and try and locate a piece right on that edge. So it can be very different, I think, in different works. I think that
to make it ambiguous.
So some work may seem more found object-y, but how do you make it still feel like it's intimate in a way that it somehow displays behavior, that there's a hand or there's a relationship created between the viewer and the object that's surprising. And other work, a lot of it will be actually, made by hand.
How do you go about collecting these materials? I mean, do the materials come about where you just have a store room and you just buy things and you add them to them, or do you go out shopping for your for piece by piece?
I mean, I think it's both. I think that it's kind of, I sort of think of it like a palette that grows and has this kind of Darwinian process where things will die out over the years or things will stay. And usually I think the way that they end up staying in is that they have this quality of sitting between many things. So they can formally work, they can work for color, they can work for texture, and that sort of painterly way I was thinking of, and they can work in terms of subject. So they can act like a tool. Their practical use becomes information.
Do you sometimes feel like something might be missing, and then you then have to go out and find the things that are missing, and you're, either because of color or form or content?
Sure, I just finished a piece at the High Museum in Atlanta, and I went down and then I came home and it needed more red, so I went to the closet and found things that made sense that had red in it, and brought a suitcase down and put it in. So it can be that simple. But I mean, it's easier for me to talk about things that are right there. So this piece, this piece, it's an interesting. I think it's interesting. I wouldn't have approached this work in terms of materials,
right?
But it was a piece actually I did at the Asia Society for its reopening, and I wanted to find a space where it would be discovered, that it would be found, that your experience of seeing the work wouldn't be that it was on a pedestal. It was right next to the Rockefeller collection of ancient works, and I wanted to really play off this idea of something that was kind of not monumental by nature. So it's actually the hallway by the freight elevator. And in terms of materials, this goes back to the material question. I want it to be something that actually could be there in some ways. So the piece that you saw with the soap, a lot of the things were just things that were in my pocket or in my bag, then put out there, so that the jump is not so far from art to life. So there wasn't that much to deal with that would really be there that was from life. So I started to make this out of the paint on the wall. So the whole piece the idea was that it was a sort of a natural occurrence that happened on site, and that the piece would come from this peeling on the wall. And as you got closer, the scale of the piece became entirely different as you were sort of sucked into the work, but that it was almost as if there was a decay on the wall that turned into this event. And then in terms of materials, I wanted there to be this idea that there was different times where you got to the material. So we got to the piece, so that that line that's a caution line and a light was almost as if it had been discovered already, but then the natural occurrence and that discovery, you see the hands mix. But in terms of any one of the objects, for example, let's take the ruler. So the ruler to me was interesting because it was just a stupid comment on scale in a literal way, and that when we look at this, we don't know what we're looking at, but then when we look at it, we know exactly what we're looking at. So it locates you when you're dislocated. That a ruler could be bent and have the kind of speed of something like a futurist painting. But it's just a plastic ruler that's bent. So that can be something very simple, but then also have this kind of leap to something perhaps dynamic or spectacular.
So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about site. I mean, when you're offered an opportunity to do something, are you assigned a site?
Right.
Do you ask for certain sites? Do you see your work as being site-specific, or do you see yourself as just responding to the site, or all of the above?
So usually my experience has been that people have offered me a choice of a site, not always, but definitely I think of this site as almost like the way you start a canvas, and then the first thing I think about is how you're going to approach it. What's the first thing you're going to see? As you move closer, how is that revealed? What's the scale? What's the use of the space? So definitely the decisions start in a very specific way. You had asked me earlier about using exit signs and things that already exist, and I was interested in this idea of any space having sort of the requirement for emergency exits, for information that told you about how to move in a time, just very practical information about how you're supposed to move through space. even maybe just having studied architecture, just requirements for a space and why they exist. So this is a piece that I was asked to do. Again, this, for example, in this piece, they said you can do it anywhere you want in the museum. You have free reign. And it was kind of mind-boggling to me that they had their paintings like a Delaunay with this safety guard over the bottom of the painting, and then to hang actually an exit sign. This is in France at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. That they would have an exit sign hung that's actually lit next to a painting about 4 inches. So, and these were all over. So I actually put installations actually on the exit signs throughout the museum. You know, this is to me this is an interesting example of how I will make very, very specific decisions about a site, and then, you know, people will say, well, can you actually move this? Is it possible? And in the beginning, I didn't know. You know, when I first started making art as a graduate student, I just decided I was going to make the work. I wasn't going to answer those questions until they happened. And so when work was moved, and when people daringly said, actually, we want to own this, can we own it? What I did was make a list of rules. You know, you have to enter here. You need what you need. You need to have this much of an approach. You need to have natural light. You need to have a corner. What are required, and then can it be translated? And you know, it was surprising to me. This is another view of the same piece. It was surprising to me that so this piece was at a gallery in Chelsea, and this is the piece at the MCH in Chicago. And I actually liked the piece better in Chicago. It was not made for the space, but this space fit the requirements for it. You know, and
is it the same piece?
It's the same piece.
I mean, do you think of it as the same piece?
It is exactly the same piece, so it's
but not exactly the same place.
Yes, I mean nothing is moved in the work. So there's not a cut in the wall. There's not a cut in the wall here, which was something, you know. But I actually like it without it. So it was interesting, this idea of, and also this idea of how do you make something feel specific? How do you make it feel like it happened the moment? You know, if you put one thing like your plane ticket to Chicago with the date on it, everything gets read as having happened there. It's interesting. Or if you put one line that connects to a door that would be impossible to have known was there, it somehow fixes the whole piece in the location.
But you do see that there are better installations of the same piece.
You know, it's funny. I don't know. Do you think this is a better installation?
Not actually being in the space.
Yeah.
It's hard for me. But you said you sort of preferred one, so it's just interesting, the idea that you take a piece, you respond to the location, you have certain requirements. But at what point does it become a different piece? Is what I'm curious about. It's no longer the same piece, or therefore you're judging it as to have different quality.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, you know, I used to think of it like when you take all of your things, you move, and to an entirely different location. It's amazing how when you move to a new location, it still feels like your own in this very strange way, that your things moved still maintain a very strong personality. So that's one way of thinking about it, just a way that things really operate in space. And another way is, like, I love seeing shows in different museums, following an installation of a show in different museums, because if you see, you know, the Calder show here, and then you see it at SF Moment, it is a different show, right? It's an entirely different show. I mean, in many ways, a lot of the ideas I'm thinking about are curatorial ideas about how someone enters the space, how it reveals itself, what's juxtaposed.
So in a sense, then, you see you're building into the work itself all those variabilities. In other words, the constant is all of the changes as much as the constant elements that you have within it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like you're allowing for all those chances, because we were also talking earlier, what happens if a work has Q-tips in it, or certain matchbooks, or things that are not available in 10 or 20 years, and you have to replace it with different things. You know, how again does that change over time? Because you're saying they can be performed again. Right. I mean, it may be like music, where musical instruments are no longer available in the same way. Is it still the same piece if you're playing a harpsichord versus a piano.
Right. I mean, we were talking a little bit while people were sitting down about Sol LeWitt and his scores and conceptually what it meant. And it was an interesting conversation because Adam was talking, well, you were talking about Sol LeWitt, you should probably talk about it yourself. But he was talking about how originally he had really, he had this very sort of rational idea that you would have a score and it would get executed. But then as he saw them made, there were actually executions that he liked better. And then he made a sort of either a requirement or a recommendation that very specific people that he trained could do the work. So in some ways it became about a formally tight piece, not a conceptually tight piece. I told Adam that when I was in graduate school, I actually wrote my thesis on the life of work over time, and this idea of how different artists had conceptualized how their work would survive over time. You know, for me, one of the most interesting people was Felix Gonzalez Torres, because he knew he was going to die before he finished, before he was aware of his death, and so he went and he documented all of his work. And the thing that was interesting to me is that he documented each piece individually, not conceptually across the board. So you'd have a candy piece, two candy pieces that looked very similarly, but he would have them installed with very different directions, in my mind, conceptually. And to me, that was very freeing, because I realized, you know, that I was okay. It sort of gave me permission to make any piece and then decide how it was going to be dealt with. And I think this is operatively true. We were talking about this because you take someone like Dan Flavin, and like the bulbs are not made anymore. And how that is dealt with, it actually is, he wouldn't even know. Like, his work may become expensive enough so that people will fabricate those. It's just true, it's a fact, right? So you can't really determine how work is actually going to be preserved over time. The hardest work that's owned of mine, the biggest problem that's come up, are ones that have video in it. And this is because the equipment, and those of you who've dealt with video know this, the equipment changes so radically. Polaroid, you know, people are actually, Adam brought this point up, that Polaroid is actually being refabricated.
Even though the company doesn't exist. Right?
Yeah. So in some ways, I think, you know, you give the most specific instructions you can as an artist.
And then accept that it's going to change.
And then accept that it...
Well, I was thinking, because I was at the Barnes Foundation recently looking at a great Matisse painting, and they were talking about how all the yellows had completely changed color, but they couldn't redo it, even though they had known it changed radically. But we're still looking at Matisse, and maybe that's true with all works of art. We're looking at those works of art. Maybe this is a curatorial problem, not the artist's problem, but we're looking through the veils of time. I mean, it's like the big debates they had about the Sistine Chapel. Are you looking at the Sistine Chapel? We're used to looking at it dirty all these years, and then when they cleaned it up, everybody said it looked too bright, you know?
Right.
So there's this whole thing about time and how it changes, but I think your work has so much of those questions of time embedded, because it's not a singular object, but an object that has so much multiplicity to it that it constantly, to me, asks those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's supposed, that anxiety is supposed to be on the surface in my work. You know, when you look at a Dan Flavin, you're not thinking about ephemerality. But, you know, so that, to me, it was actually interesting to make work where you feared its existence and you feared whether it could survive. You know, I think the most common question, so now you can't ask this question at the end, I think it's at every single lecture, someone asks, you know, how long did it take you to put up? How long did it take you to come down? Does it exist still? How long was it up? And the fact that that question is asked is interesting to me, that the fragility of the time that this either took to make, will it exist, that you have this anxiety around its existence is actually, it should be on the surface of the work, I think.
Right. But, you know, we always think of art as having, you know, hopefully having some kind of eternal presence, and that's one of the questions that I think your work always asks is, you know, can remain, and how long can it remain, and under what conditions? But so this is the MIT piece.
Yeah, I mean, I put this in here because you know, Adam had asked about site specificity, and you again, this idea that in my mind, I'm trying to sort of build it into the very experience of making or seeing the work. So this was I was trying to figure out how do you make a permanent piece that's totally flexible, that is in flux, that has this kind of viral quality to it, and that can kind of, almost like a kit that you can bring to any site and then it becomes specific to that site. So I made this piece that was a fire escape that was basically scaled to a cat. So it's like a kit, and it has 3 parts to it. It's 12 of each part. So you have a ladder, a balcony, and a stair. And you bring that kit to any location and it can be put together like an erector set to sort of be built around that site. I actually brought only one image of it. This is at a dorm at MIT. So, and in theory, you can buy this and put it up, and you can make the decisions about how it climbs on a building, on an interior, on an exterior, and can be totally different in different sites. So just conceptually, this idea of how do you make a work that is always going to be site specific? And I think that there are things in all of the pieces. There are things that this kind of kit-like temporal quality, things on wheels, things that are clamped together, things that you feel like you can sort of put together, pack up, and put up again. Is really
do-it-yourself sensibility.
Yes.
So I mentioned in my introduction the difference between scale and size, and I mean one of the things I'm always amazed about your work is how, on one hand, I want to get down on my hands and knees and go up and look at every little detail of it, but the impossibility of doing that, except perhaps for the artist who put it out there to begin with. But just the minute quality that you're dealing with, but yet you come in and you're actually overwhelmed by the scale. And I just thought it would be helpful to understand for you what's the difference between scale and size as you understand it, and what are you trying to do with those differences?
So, I could answer that in many ways, but I will answer that in relation to this piece specifically. I think, I've often been interested in this kind of radical shift in scale, and that almost takes out the middle ground, so that you have a very, very large view of something, and then you go shoot down to this minutia. Actually saw this very early on in my life in a science class. It was Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Ames, and this sort of the speeding up those shifts in scale. So this is a piece I did at SF MoMA. It's all the way down the side. There are many things I was thinking about at the time. It's a really, in terms of this idea of reacting to a site, it's a very rigorously symmetrical building, very didactic that way in terms of symmetry. And I wanted to do a piece that had this quality of something that had happened very quickly in space. So and that you didn't understand it when you first got in, but you wanted to sort of get up to that location. So just to do the radical shift in scale, this is what you see at one point in the piece. So you shift down very radically. To get there, you have to climb the stairs. And it's actually it's a Jeep Cherokee that was sliced into 5 parts. And then, so I wanted to sort of transform to the point where you didn't understand. That wasn't the first thing you understood about them. Again, I was playing with this idea of as you move through the space, the piece changes radically. Has a night view, has a day view. This is the back of the car, and that's what you see as you get up close. And this is something you see just alone on the stair, sort of a one-to-one view of it, and that this kind of sort of intimacy where your whole sense of your body changes, that the piece surrounds you.
And it changes as you move through it.
And it changes completely as you move through it.
It's very cinematic, really. I mean, because you're kind of focusing on the detail of the person drinking the cup, and then the next thing you know, you're going way back out and coming back in again.
Absolutely. I actually think a lot about cinema, and about also that if you've ever done editing, you know that all of the meaning becomes between those juxtapositions, right? So that it's really it's a cut. It's the in-between space that creates the experience. So it's like this anticipation or the desire of seeing any of these moments, of one leading to the next. I think that's really crucial.
And so are you pretty aware as people walk through it of the idea of trying to get them to make those shifts from large to small, I mean, intuitively?
Yes, intuitively, and also, I think I'm interested in this idea, which I think happens with film, which is that you feel as if you allow people to feel as if they're wandering, but they're actually very directed. you know, I've talked about it in terms of Japanese gardening, where there's actually these locations where in Japanese gardens, they're made to mimic nature, so you feel like you're on a kind of meandering walk. And there's actually these locations where you look, there'll be a step where you look down, and when you look up, it's completely composed in front of you. So there'll be like a very distant landscape, but you feel as if it's something you discovered yourself. So in very much this idea of you know, again, and this goes back to the lack of boundaries. I was not interested in installation art where there's a curtain or there's a step, and you know, now I am actually entering art, and now I'm leaving art. But that you, as a viewer, you find yourself in the middle of it somehow.
But yet, what I'm amused of is the kind of the tensions between the idea that it seems as if it has a kind of random, open-ended quality, which there are aspects of it. On the other hand, you're totally controlling the experience too. I mean, very, very much thinking about it. I mean, it's illusionism, you know, going back to the whole tradition of illusionistic painting and sculpture.
Right. I mean, this is the last detail of it. I mean, I think it's a really, it's a very fine line to tread in terms of, you know, for me, the use of, I'm using the word theatrical in a specific way, but not to always have it flip back to feeling very mundane, so that it doesn't feel like when you see. Yeah, and that the spectacle is really, you're making the spectacle as much as I am. That jump is not, there's a choice. You're choosing whether to engage or not. Is that?
Yeah.
I put these in because in the terms of the scale shifts, just because, you know, scale shift you can literally see, but I think also what's really important is, or the harder thing to play with is this idea of scale shifts in terms of intimacy, monumentality, emotional scale shifts. I think that, you know, to try and find something like a piece of toilet paper and actually invest it with a kind of emotional value. So I put these in because it's sort of a much more kind of direct example of that. I was asked I was asked to give a donation to a nonprofit, and I didn't have anything immediately available that I thought could be auctioned. So I said to them, well, I'll do a portrait. You can auction a portrait. It's going to be on a 7.5 by 11 piece of regular paper. It's going to be in pencil. It's going to be like a letter. And the person who buys this, it will be a portrait of them, or they can have it of someone else. And they should give me 12 of the most important events in their life, and that I will draw these. And so I drew them in a way where I made them up out of their descriptions. They tumbled from there was no hierarchy in terms of their experience. People gave me things that ranged from death to, you know, like washing their laundry. So it was very interesting that there was this range. But, you know, it was conceptually about creating a relationship, making it work, you know, in collaboration, what a portrait really is. Then the letter was completely destroyed, and the person is anonymous. But it was a more sort of, you know, it's a different way of looking at how scale shifts, I think, work in my work, so I put it in there.
I wanted her to put in this piece. This is actually one of the pieces that I first saw of yours, I think. This is the Berlin piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I remember walking in and feeling like I had seen something quite radically different, and not knowing what to expect. And you know, one of the things I'm struck by is how kind of dematerialized a lot of these pieces are. I mean, there's all this ephemeral materials, and I was thinking, you know, you were saying a little earlier, you referred to Richard Serra a little bit, and I was thinking how your work, on one hand, seems very opposite from a Richard Serra or a Judd or a Donald Judd or a Carl Andre. But then I was thinking about it actually as we were talking, and actually there's an incredible light touch to Richard Serra's work, despite the fact that it's very heavy materials, and very, you know, involved with gravity and weight and mass, where yours is almost the opposite. But I'm curious, I mean, how do you see your work in relationship to Richard Serra? You mentioned Serra earlier.
You know, it's interesting
Doesn't look
'cause,
anything like it, obviously. Is it a reaction to that type of work?
is it a reaction to? No, I don't think it's a reaction to directly. I think, you know, I think Richard is he's like I said, he's a magician with materials. There's a kind, and I think that what's interesting to me about him is there's a kind of intense intimacy he has with metal and with his materials. You know, there are amazing stories about his father working with metal. He worked in a metal yard as a pretty young. So I think he has he has an amazing ability to make something that's quite monumental, but also has a kind of fragility to it in my own mind. It's interesting, this a huge compliment to me quite early on, that he saw that show, for me, what meant a lot to me, but he saw that show at Marion Boesky, and he really, he approached me and talked to me about what he thought was interesting in my work, and it was mostly about process and about creating different kind of rules about making work, and not using work as a metaphor to illustrate something else, but for the process itself to be the narrative. Which I thought was interesting. I actually saw him when I was an undergraduate at Yale. He did a piece on site there too, and seeing it be installed on site and transform that space. I mean, he's also very much in much of his work, a very site-specific artist, and to see how he will transform a space, I think that's something else that I think is actually, you know, whether it's a light hand, a heavy hand, a large thing, a small thing. It's more about
It's not a male-female kind of thing at all from your perspective.
Not for me. What about you? What do you think?
I think I gave myself away. Why don't we move on?
So, but this is the first piece you saw, yeah?
Yes, that was the first one. I remember going in, and I remember just the sense of being totally surrounded by it and not quite knowing where to stand, literally and metaphorically, in relation to it. Just delighted by it. I mean, it was something that I wanted to see more, and happy that I am.
I mean, the one thing I would say that was interesting, this piece, sorry?
Yeah, the tank element there.
No, I was going to say that it was actually, there's a crack in the wall that actually the piece followed, that led the piece. And it was in Berlin. The building doesn't exist anymore. It's right up against the wall, and it was actually the old Academy of Art on the east side. And when the wall came down, it was in very bad shape. It had been bombed in World War II. And it was actually the studio of Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect. So it was a very haunted, very heavy place. And I did a lot of reading on him, and it's interesting to me in terms of the questions of ephemerality. It's kind of bizarre, you know, in the context of who he was, you know, very kind of with very evil intentions. But what was interesting about him and, you know, sort of the whole aesthetic, the way they used aesthetics with politics, which was very, you know, strong, with a strong hand. He was involved in this studio in designing Germania, which was supposed to be the capital of Germany, you know, that they were going to plan. And what he did was he studied the ruins of great civilizations to build the future Germania. And this idea of the incredible, you know, hubris of that, but also this idea that thinking about actually of making a great ruin ahead of its own time was actually a kind of amazing idea to me.
So are there aspects in this work that it all refer to Speer or to the
content? When I was thinking about this idea of a kind of insane ambition that was growing beyond its own capacity to hold itself. So this whole piece, actually, if you remember, it had an arm that was blowing, so the whole thing was about to fall over.
Right.
Yeah, which was a kind of idea that I thought of. It was also this idea of something being incendiary, that it was all matches that could fall apart. So this little arm here, it's right here, this is a matchbox that's being blown by this fan, which actually shakes the entire thing. I was pretty early on in making work, and I wasn't sure I was going to stay up, but it did.
And this piece is...
But this you had asked me about this decision to scale up, because a lot of my early work was really, in many ways, was about I was really interested in this idea of the experience of seeing as being one of discovery, that you found it, and you literally found it in a place where it wasn't presented to you. And so, it was a big transition to make something, I could have gone to this space and sort of done it in the corners and in the closets, and I decided, this is a Jean Nouvel building, it's the Cartier Foundation in Paris, and I decided with this piece that gave me the whole ground floor that I would scale the work up and have a conversation with the building. That was actually where the voice of the work was actually much higher. And so, Berlin was sort of the beginning of that, and then this piece was all made out of ladders, and the reason I chose to work with ladders was that it was a found object that actually literally dealt with the scale of your body in relationship to architecture, that everything about it, sort of like the ruler in the last piece, but everything about it told you about scale, so you sat in this location where you couldn't figure out how far away or how big something was, but then you actually knew exactly how big it was because you know what your body's relationship.
So you envisioned it both as a night piece and a day piece?
Yes.
Right? I mean, so you were composing it at night and thinking about lighting and the whole idea of the kind of storefront quality of it, as well as what it would be like when the light was gone?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. You got that from the first one, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of my work has this, because it's lit internally. So, this is, again, an idea that was sort of away from the theatrical, that everything in the piece was part of the piece, that it wasn't about that light there, lighting it, or, anything to do with the building, but that it was actually a self-sustaining system. It was also this idea of, this basic question of why does something become valuable? And I wanted to play with this idea of a work of art actually having its own life support system, so that the air, the water, the light was all actually part of a system that was, and therefore it was fragile and therefore could fail.
Right. Oh yes. You've mentioned in the past that you admired the work of Gordon Matta Clark, the artist who is perhaps best known for his piece Splitting, when he kind of sawed the house in half in New Jersey. I think that's how most people know the work. I was very interested in your connection to Gordon Matta Clark and architecture and the idea of cutting into the supports and the relationship. It's something that you still do in your work a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting, father painter studied architecture, comes to sculpture. And I'm father architect, studied painting. But he does, I think he comes to that, to that intersection in an interesting way. He also, this isn't actually the work that I brought, but he also did that really beautiful piece about where he bought the little corner, he bought all the little plots of land.
Right, exactly. Right. It was the leftover pieces of land from sales where it might be a strip that's 1 foot wide and about 6 blocks long, that type of thing.
Yeah, and that was the piece. That was also an influential idea about this sort of idea of these sort of leftover spaces, and that went unnoticed, and where the scraps between the two lots. But I was thinking about conical intersect, and about in this piece just about how you can break through a space, how you can create a new frame, how architecture can be dissolved. And this was in a group show that went between the upstairs space and the lower space of a gallery. So I made this hole in the floor, and actually it was a group show, and they put a Gordon Matta Clark right next to it, which was great. But so the hole went through the floor, and the piece of floor went to the bottom and hit down here. And actually it was all on a pulley system, and at the front, I don't have the images out. At the front there was a little pulley system. The fan went back and forth on the upstairs, and the pulley system dipped a piece of paper in ink that went up and down, and then the ink slowly grew back along this string and up the wall.
Does your work make you laugh sometimes? I mean, when you're actually doing it, do you find yourself fully amused as you know? Because I just find that there's an incredible sense of humor in your light touch, and I have to say that many times when I've smiled or even laughed at elements within your piece. So I'm wondering, do you see that element of humor and joke as you're going along? Not that it's a joke, but I mean that there's that kind of that edge.
No, it is a solid joke. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I think it's so important to me, and definitely it's only funny when it's discovered funny in the moment that gets translated, I think. I think that's crucial. When we're talking about the rules and surprise, the best things that happen in a work are actually the things that you didn't know were going to happen, right? But I think humor is crucial in terms of play, and in terms of play in every sense of that word, whether it's like giving room for play, whether it's setting up a system and breaking it. And I think humor always has a kind of subversion in it. Whether you recognize it immediately, it always has a submersive sort of underbelly to it.
And you were talking about systems and kind of closed systems and open systems, and you've always been kind of interested in the relationship between kind of macros and micro systems. And I thought maybe if you could show us a few images and talk us through a little bit about your thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about systems earlier, and we were talking a little bit about this idea of making a work that's like a live experiment that actually has behaviors or that's modeling behaviors. And so this is a work I did in Venice for the Venice Biennale in 1998. And when I actually, it was one of the first sites where they gave me a site and they didn't let me see it. And I looked at the plans, and there was this small closet where they kept all of the cleaning supplies. So I decided to use that, and then they opened the window on the other side. But the thing that's interesting to me, looking back on this piece, is the way that I did it was I put in lamps first, and then I had this idea that the work actually had to sort of flee to these lamps locations to actually survive. Almost like it had the behavior of something that needed to support its life, and then it went out the window. This window, it was an old Scala window that existed that they'd covered, and then it had an arm that went out to the lake, or to the canal, I should say, and it had a buoy on it. So whenever the boats went by, it hit back on the window itself. So it had this sort of like.
It's like a whole series of chain reactions. One thing leads to the next thing, which leads to the next. I mean, there's a little bit of the Rube Goldberg quality to it, where everything leads to the next thing, and it takes you through the whole series of incidents.
Yeah, and just the piece itself sort of was relying on a very random event of somebody going by in a canal to work. So that could even be seen as like a model for actual movement on the canal. But this idea of modeling and modeling behavior was interesting, because there was I thought a really nice observation made by Arthur Danto. He said to me, your work is not like architectural models. It's much more like scientific models, because an architectural model is built, to actually be a stand-in for something to be built. But your work actually is the environment itself, and it's modeling a behavior. It's showing behavior itself. It's showing how things work. It's not to be rebuilt. And so I took that as it was a really interesting comment to me. So I decided to actually make a model, to do sort of the dumbest thing and try making a scientific model. So I had this idea to try and make a planetarium. And at first I thought, this is really, it's so hokey to make like actually a globe that you recognize. But I liked this idea that the one was that the work itself was almost like a device, that it worked like a mechanism. Like the sculpture, it wasn't just a sculpture, it was a sculpture to produce this kind of absurd sculpture to produce just that as a projection. And also that when you moved into it, it had this very different feeling of when you saw a globe. But because
outside and then go within it.
To go within it was such a non-intuitive thing, that you were sheltered.
Well, it's kind of science fiction too.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And then this was just a really classic model of, example of a model. So this is called Model of a Habitat, for a habitat, and it's on the High Line.
Did any birds actually go in?
Tons.
They did?
Yeah.
I never saw any of the birds inside. They did?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it literally was an experiment. We didn't know whether they would or not. I did a lot of research, and the people who were right said, urban birds are scrappy. If you put out, because they'll basically eat out of your hands.
Birds.
Yeah, New York birds. So, and even though people were walking right by, if there was food in it, it was completely, clustered, covered. And the biggest problem was what the Audubon Society said, which was that the birds would eat the feed in about an hour. And also they know, so they actually, the birds all knew.
So the birds were smarter than
the people, yeah. I can talk more about it, or we should probably should we go through the next one? Yeah.
Anyway, that's great. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing that I thought was the two things that you brought up here. I mean, I think this play with scale architecturally was interesting to me, and that the High Line also. I really wanted. I think the High Line is such an incredible, urban experiment, so successful that I also had this question of, does it need art? It is in some ways, in my mind, it is a grand.
So what did you decide?
Art project. Well, I decided one that it framed something that already existed, and something that existed there was this kind of incredible reality of urban wildlife. And so to make something that where people took, this was apparently the most photographed location on the High Line, and it was all pictures of birds. Those birds exist a block away, but to create a place where you were like, oh my God, this is incredible, there's a bird here, to create that frame for something that already existed was very interesting to me. And then the second thing was to get people to engage. I wanted it to play on this idea of a shooting space in Manhattan.
It has a very perspectival quality. I remember it's really almost like one-point perspective, and then it exploded.
Yeah, and that was to play on this. I think one of the other things that you don't realize about moving in Manhattan is constantly having a choice on the grid, and that this is such an unusual space because it's like a Midwestern highway where you just walk and that's all you do. And I think the success of the High Line is actually not only what they did, but what they didn't do, which is there's nothing to do there. And that is an incredible thing in Manhattan. And so
although there's art, so there's something to do.
Now there's something to do. Yeah, but a lot of people didn't even didn't think this was art, which was nice too, right? But so I wanted to play on this idea of a trajectory. But the last thing that I thought was successful that I don't think people necessarily even realize is that it's bisected. I mean, it's obvious, but it's bisected by the promenade. And so you have to engage. So it's not like this plop art on the side, which is, that you walk by, you walk through it. And that was, I think, crucial sort of to the solution.
Well, I felt that we had to at least talk about the piece that you did here, which was actually right out in that empty space. You can all turn to your left. But I thought maybe you could just talk to us about how this piece came about, and also this, to me, in some ways, was a little bit of a return to the earlier work, in the sense that you were now looking down on it like a two-dimensional composition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a crazy and amazing architectural decision to on this avenue to push back the building and have a moat that you cross over to get into the building, and then to create this underground space in Manhattan. It's very unusual. It's amazing that they got it done, right? But I think the one thing that probably happened is that because of, probably just for safety reasons, the walls are high, and so a lot of people don't even realize that they're coming in on a bridge. And so I really wanted to make people look over the edge, and to really play with this idea of this incredible space that is dug out in the middle of Manhattan and below ground. So the whole idea of this piece was sort of to play on this idea of the skin of the pavement and then what's below it, and this idea also that when you have walking down the street in Manhattan and there's some electrical problem and they pull back the pavement and it's this insane underworld that you realize that we're functioning or not functioning with, to sort of play on that idea. There's this.
It's like skin.
Yes, it's like a skin. I mean, there's this beautiful idea by Kazuo Ono, who's a Butoh dancer, that there are three spaces. It's a very Butoh idea, but there are three spaces in the world. There's outside of the skin, and they're equal. There's the skin, and there's below the skin. And this idea that the skin and below the skin, are, in the skin particularly, is equal to anything else is a very interesting idea to me, because we're so focused on exterior. So often I think the work has this thing of a location where you go under or above. And then when you came down, I wanted to play on this idea of that underworld of a garden. This was my favorite part of the piece, actually, was this water fountain here. There's also this kind of really dry, deserted feeling in this. It's sort of cellar-like quality, and this being so wet was actually my favorite part.
It felt like urban planning run amok.
Yes.
So this is, it was like your architectural side, just going nuts.
I hope so, yeah. and I actually hadn't thought of these in such direct relation, but when I was thinking about, you had asked me to talk a little about the process and this idea of going below under. This came afterwards. This is a piece called Corner Plot that I did on the southeast corner of Manhattan. And again, it was really about playing with with this edge and making a piece that felt like it was either sinking or coming out of the ground and sort of caught in that state. We talked about this, the best parts of work are the things you don't really, this is my favorite view of it, and I didn't know it would be, but there's the night view and these relationships to the windows. This corner is actually a reflection of that corner there, so it's the catty corner part of that building. And this is what you saw when you went in, and it was this idea actually that you had asked me about, we would talk about, was about orientation and disorientation. And that when you looked into the piece, you completely lost sense of your orientation. So this is a plumb bob right here. So that's telling you where the gravity of the space is. But when you looked in, I wanted it to actually shift, and that you sort of tumbled into the space visually, and you couldn't figure out what you were looking at.
So maybe we'll end with these last few slides
Okay,
here. But this actually is a little bit of a harking back to that earlier piece also. I was wondering about, when you're physically working in the studio, there's almost a sense that you're performing the piece as you're actually making it. And I'm just wondering about your sense of your work as a performance, and almost like a score that you're playing out, although it's in your own head. And do you see your work as having a relationship to performance? And then one other question too that's sort of related is that idea of it being a narrative in some way. Do you see the work as somehow unfolding in time and telling a story or series of stories?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because particularly early on, whenever I did stuff in museums, they would say, can we just open early and people can watch you install?
The artist in the cage?
The monkey. They want to see time lapses. And I think to me, what's really interesting is how objects can work as evidence of time and behavior. So I think it's much more interesting to actually see the leftovers of something and for it to instigate your imagination than to actually see it being made, in my own mind. So this idea of remnants or leftovers or evidence of time or of space is what's interesting. This is a piece that is at the gallery that represents me, Tanya Benakdar Gallery, that I did a show with at the gallery a few years ago, and this was when you entered, and it's actually a piece that probably it's in the in the sort of thematic area of pieces that many people probably didn't see. So when you walk into the gallery, it's open and visible to you. To the right is over the desk is where the catalogs are, but these are all casts of the recycling or the objects or the things that we used during the time of making the work. So every day there was
a diary then.
Yes, and it was like a diary of actually time, space, liquid, and what was used, and they became sort of like space holders. And maybe the way, in my mind, the way that Gordon Matta Clark had these sort of like, how do you? They're called imposters in some ways in my head, that they're sort of space fillers, but
is
they
this
mark.
a repeatable piece, or is it or an ephemeral piece? It happened once, and that's
it. Happened once, yeah. And so they were sort of. This is where they were found. How are we doing for time?
We'll do one more slide. Can't help it. You have so many good pictures here, but I just. So we'll just, why don't we, this also, I want to talk a little bit about that sense of, orientation and disorientation. And I was also thinking too, again, a very kind of far-fetched connection, and we were talking about this earlier, was, artists like James Turrell and Doug Wheeler, in that sense. In their case, they're creating these very pure theatrical spaces that become totally physically disorienting. And again, your work doesn't look anything like it, but yet there is that same kind of, or a sense of disorientation and upending people's physical sense of gravity, where they're standing. Mm-hmm. Is there a correct place to stand? When are you in the piece? When are you outside the piece? Actually, I thought you said something very funny before when you were talking about seeing there was this Doug Wheeler piece that was at David's Warner Gallery, and in order to go into the piece, you had to wear these little booties. And so Sarah said to me, the booties were as interesting to me, I think, as the piece itself in a way, or part of the piece itself. And I said, maybe you could just, we'll end with these last couple ones.
So yeah, we were talking about, he had asked me, you had brought up Turrell and Wheeler, and I was saying that, I mean, I think that Turrell is also a good example. I mean, to me, the Turrell sky pieces are my favorite pieces of his, and what's so incredible to me is actually when you're looking at them and then a bird goes by. And it's actually that breaking of the minimalism and that chance and that moment that you know you can't reproduce, that to me is the most interesting part. And so what I was saying with the Wheeler too, it's like when that edge is broken, when that, you know, the Wheeler, you go in and it was incredible. I mean, you went in and you couldn't, I felt nauseous. It completely takes over your perception. But you know, I'm more interested in how incredible it is the way this light is reflecting here, and that you're looking at that and you realize actually how simple it is. And so to me, the Wheeler was funny. The whole process of waiting in line, putting on the, it's not that it's two-staged, but it's part of it. It's not that. It doesn't lessen the experience, but it is the real experience, right? I mean, it doesn't make it, it's part of, in my mind, it's part of it. The fact that you wait in line, that you take off your shoes, that you put on the medical booties, that you were worried about staining it, that, you know, as you leave, you see people waiting, watching you come out. That's part of the experience, right? There isn't, you can't say that it suddenly happens and it doesn't.
Right, it's the going in and the coming out as well as being in it. Well, I have to say, you've totally disoriented me this evening, because I could go on probably for hours, but I think, why don't we have, I think, time for a few questions for people. So, anybody want to brave a question or two? You're welcome to.
Word architectonic.
You'll have to speak up loudly.
Architectonic.
Mm-hmm.
How does it differ from kinesthetic?
How does architectonic differ from kinesthetic, I think is what you're asking. No. This is where I'm the interviewer, not the artist.
I mean, I think it's subject to interpretation, but kinesthetic, in my mind, would be a work that moves, right?
Well, kinesthetic is something that you have like a physical
relationship with.
Exactly.
But what is architectonic?
Something that is more like architecture.
Right.
So I guess your work has both qualities to it, perhaps.
So the question is, what's the difference in my work?
Okay. I make it personal, sure.
I'm not, tell me how you're using those words, I'm sorry.
Well, we learned, some years ago about kinetic art.
Oh, kinetic. I thought you said kinesthetic. So you said kinetic.
Did I say kinesthetic?
I thought you said
did.
kinetic.
Oh, you did? Oh, then I misheard. Excuse me. So kinetic. Okay. The difference between kinetic art and architectonic. So it's kinetic.
Yes, so moving.
So moving.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I think they're entirely different, aren't they? I may be misunderstanding the question.
You know what's interesting about it? You're right, they're entirely different, but when I saw your work, when I see your work, I think movement.
Even
Yeah.
when it's not physically moving.
Yeah.
Yes. I think
Yeah.
that's true.
I mean, I think most of the work does have some movement in it, some real movement, and usually the movement is not, it's not a movement that's mechanized. I'm interested in a movement that actually is a kind of either like a fluttering or a wave, or a movement that has the kind of, that's a reaction to wind, or that's a reaction, so that it has a kind of a lack of control to it. So it can be literally kinetic that way, but then also I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I talked a little bit about the Italian futurists, about the constructivists. These are people that are really interesting to me, and how you make something feel dynamic without and having movement and having time in it, even when it's static.
It's the illusion of it.
Yeah.
When you take one of these incredibly complex pieces, has tens of thousands of tiny little parts, and you're asked to move it from place A to place B, which obviously involves photographs and schematics and blah, 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 blah. Is it exciting or is it terribly boring to have to move it and
The question
recreate
was,
it?
with you take all these objects and you move these thousands of objects and you have diagrams and everything, is it exciting or boring to move it from one place to another?
That's the question.
I guess I see it as part of the entire process. I think it informs, it's to me, it's really integral to the entire work, that like, as sort of that earlier answer about how long does it take to put up, how long does it take to come down, that you know that that's really integral to the work itself. And sort of the labor, the marathon, the logic, the lack of logic. How do you preserve something that seems chance? You know, how do you preserve an intimate hand when necessity of time and location requires you to work with many people? So those are things that I think are embedded in the work already. So I see it as part of the process.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the investment building? Especially with, you address that building itself, which is kind of like, sort of like closed fortress, monumental, government lit type building, and if I look at this total light around it, are you gonna be inside and outside the building?
So the question is, if she,
What are you gonna do?
what is she going to do at the Venice Biennale with this little self-enclosed fortress-like building in the Venice Pavilion?
Yeah, I am dealing with that the building is this neoclassical building that actually has this kind of, it has a, well, I guess the first thing I would say is it has a kind of awkward circulation where you walk in, you walk left, you double back, you walk right, you double back. So I'm changing the circulation so that you can't go in and out of the exits, the emergency exits, so that it becomes, hopefully it becomes this chain of events that sort of wax and wane, that is entirely immersive. You enter the building and from one room to the next, the scale shifts, the light shifts. And in many ways, I think, you know, we talked about it tonight, Adam and I, but I think for me, what's really important is it's 6 new commissions. One of them is going to be outside. So they're all new pieces. And for me, the way that the pieces change from room to room, that transitional space is actually, I think, the most important part, which is actually the doorway, the entry from one room, the exit from another, the memory of what was before. The last show I did at Tanya Benoctor Gallery, that was, we didn't get to it, but that was very much about it. It was sort of your expectation that's built in one room and just the change that happens the next. So hopefully I'm changing that sort of hierarchical, neoclassical format and making it one that's much more about disorientation and orientation and back and forth.
So you're gonna enter in one part and exit.
Yeah, so it'll be a chain of experience in a circular way. I'm also playing with the indoor and outdoor, with that courtyard. I'm going to do a piece that is enclosed that you only get till the end, so that you don't get that information until the very end.
I thought you were sworn to secrecy. I'm impressed that you got this much out of her. I think we have time for maybe one more question. There was one back there.
Question about memory.
Can you speak a little louder, please? I'm sorry.
Question about memory, about the viewer ability to remember a work which consists of thousands or hundreds of objects.
Yes, the question is about memory of a work of art that consists of thousands of objects.
So I guess there are many ways I could answer that. I think that the idea that in the experience of the work, your experience visually would be radically different from the person who saw it right before you, because there's sort of at any one point when you're looking at something, the decision to move in any direction is so multiple. And so I think the memory of it too would be entirely different, the chain of memories, hopefully. And that some things that you might remember about a piece, if you recall it with someone else, they won't have even seen that. And I think that idea that Adam used the word narrative, that your narrative that you create through the movement, through the piece, and your memory of it is very much your own, and what you decide is important within the piece, which also goes to the portraits, is that how do you decide what experience is important? How do we frame that? What's the memory of that experience? And then what's the interpretation of that experience?
Sarah, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.